The Death of the West: How Dying Populations and Immigrant Invasions Imperil Our Country and Civilization, by Patrick J. Buchanan. Chapter 10: A House Divided. This used to be a hell of a good country. I can't understand what's gone wrong with it. Jack Nicholson, 1969, Easy Rider. The world is a fine place and worth fighting for. Ernest Hemingway, 1940, For Whom the Bell Tolls. Civilizations, nations, and states can die many ways. They can be invaded and put to the sword, as Constantinople was in 1453. They can be absorbed by empires, as the Greek city-states were by Rome, and the German principalities were by Prussia. Nations can disunite, dissolve, break apart, as Yugoslavia, the USSR, and Czechoslovakia did, though many contend that these were always artificial nations. Countries and civilizations can undergo conversions that create a new people, as happened to Ireland with St. Patrick, to Arabia with Muhammad. In Humanism and the New Order, historian Christopher Dawson, 7 decades ago, saw this happening to the West. For centuries, a civilization will follow the same path, worshipping the same gods, cherishing the same ideas, acknowledging the same moral and intellectual standards. And then, all at once, a change will come. The springs of the old life run dry, and men suddenly awake to a new world, in which the ruling principles of the former age seem to lose their validity, and to become inapplicable or meaningless. We seem to be experiencing something of the kind in Europe today. Civilizations can also fail to reproduce, and be overwhelmed by immigrants indifferent to their culture. Rome was conquered not by barbarian invasion from without, wrote Will Durant, but by barbarian multiplication from within. The rapidly breeding Germans could not understand the classic culture, did not accept it, did not transmit it. The rapidly breeding Orientals were mostly of a mind to destroy that culture. The Romans, possessing it, sacrificed it to the comforts of sterility. The West is the most advanced civilization in history, and America the most advanced nation. First in economics, science, technology, and military power. No superpower rival exists. Europe, Japan, and America control 2/3 of the world's wealth, income, and productive capacity. But America and the West face 4 clear and present dangers. The first is a dying population. Second is the mass immigration of peoples of different colors, creeds, and cultures, changing the character of the West forever. The third is the rise to dominance of an anti-Western culture in the West, deeply hostile to its religions, traditions, and morality, which has always sundered the West. The fourth is the breakup of nations and the defection of ruling elites to a world government, whose rise entails the end of nations. The West does not lack the capacity or power to repel these dangers, but it seems to lack the desire or will to maintain itself as a vital, separate, unique civilization. As the ex-Trotskyite and geostrategist James Burnham wrote over a third of a century ago, I do not know what the cause is of the West's extraordinarily rapid decline, which is most profoundly shown by the deepening loss, among the leaders of the West, of confidence in themselves and in the unique quality of their own civilization, and by a correlated weakness of the Western will to survive. The cause or causes have something to do, I think, with the decay of religion and with an excess of material luxury, and, I suppose, with getting tired, worn out, as all things temporal do. This struggle to preserve the old creeds, cultures, and countries of the West is the new divide between left and right. This struggle will define what it means to be a conservative. This is the cause of the 21st century and the agenda of conservatism for the remainder of our lives. In considering any strategy for the preservation of our culture and country, an assessment of the balance of forces is needed. Not only have the cultural institutions of the West been captured, so also have the major corporate centers of power. And just as globalism is the antithesis of patriotism, the transnational corporation is a natural antagonist of tradition. With its adaptability and amorality, it has no roots. It can operate in any system. With efficiency its ruling principle, it has no loyalty to workers and no allegiance to any nation. With share price and stock options its reason for being, it will sacrifice everything and everyone on the altar of profit. The global capitalist and the true conservative are Cain and Abel. But the growing power of global capitalism cannot be denied. Measured by GDP, 52 of the world's 100 most powerful economies are corporations, and 48 are countries. The Democratic Party is a lost cause in the culture war, and many Republicans are reluctant warriors. If a battle impends and losses are anticipated, they will vanish from camp before sunup. In cultural conflict, a Davos Republican is no match for a San Francisco Democrat. As the Cultural Revolution took generations to triumph, it will take generations to roll back. And the great battles will not be political, but moral, intellectual, and spiritual. For the adversary is not another party, but another faith, another way of seeing God and man. And the outcome will be less often decided in Congress than in the schools, the media, and the high court. For the prize contested is the souls of the young. We'll get you through your children, boasted poet Allen Ginsberg, in unconscious echo of that other cultural revolutionary, Adolf Hitler. If they do not go with us, it does not matter. We already have their children. Needed for victory is not only a conservative spirit to defend what is right about America and the West, but a counter-revolutionary spirit to recapture lost ground. To preserve their rights and their right to live as they wished, the Founding Fathers had to become rebels. So shall we. The Revolution, wrote Jean-François Revel, writes the play in which political leaders act much later. That is what this revolution has been about, capturing the culture, and with it the power to write the play in which the political leaders act. Regimes not rooted in cultures cannot endure. The Stalinist regimes in the captive nations of Eastern Europe never put down roots in the culture. When the threat of Russian tanks was gone, so were the regimes. Republicans today abandon moral terrain they confidently defended in the Reagan era because they sense the culture has turned hostile, and they may be right. There may be more of them than there are of us. Thus, conservatives need to make alliances with any who will stand with them. Not every liberal wants to see our civilization end its days in a new Babylonian captivity. Not a few conservatives have stacked arms in the culture war. This is the struggle that succeeds the Cold War and will consume the balance of our lives. While none of us may live to see the promised land, ultimately victory is assured. For we have it on the highest authority that truth crushed to earth shall rise again. Of the four clear and present dangers, the population crisis of the West is the most immediate and the most dangerous. History teaches that the correlation between power and population is not absolute. A few million British conquered a fourth of the world. Tiny Portugal and Holland seized territory and planted colonies in lands far larger and more populous: Brazil, India, China, Africa, the Indies. But population is a component of power. Soldier for soldier, the Confederacy was the equal of the Union, but there were not enough Confederates and too many Yankees. France's paranoia over a soaring German population after Versailles proved justified. Hitler's Wehrmacht may have been the superior in arms of the Red Army, but 80 million Germans ruthlessly organized under Hitler could not defeat 197 million Soviets ruthlessly organized under Stalin. A Soviet Union of 290 million could control a world empire. An aging, shrinking, dying Russia of 145 million will be fortunate to hold what it has. Indeed, one is hard-pressed to find in history any example of a family, a tribe, a people, a nation, or a civilization whose population has grown old and whose numbers have begun to shrink, that did not have taken from it what it once took from others. The death of the West may already be baked in the cake. The baby boom that began in 1946 and ended in 1964 was the largest generation in U.S. history, but it failed to reproduce itself. With its oldest now 55 and its youngest 37, that generation is about done having children. The eldest have begun to look toward retirement, when families pay down debts, curb spending, and lower consumption. Japan, where the median age is 5 years greater than in the United States, hit the wall in 1990. Real estate and equity markets collapsed and have yet to recover. In October 2001, Japanese stocks were 75% below their 1989 peak, and Japan's economy was as dormant as her population growth. Europe's populations have already begun to shrink. With fewer children entering the workforce and the number of seniors and elderly soaring, Europe must raise taxes and retirement ages and cut benefits to seniors, or import new workers. Europe will try both. As Europeans are forced to work longer for less to support the idle elderly, generational tensions will increase. And as Arabs and Africans pour in, social tensions will rise. The race riots in the Lancashire mill town of Oldham, and in Leeds, Burnley, and Bradford, the fights between Spaniards and Moroccans in El Halido, the bloody battles between French and Algerian youth in Paris, and skinhead attacks on immigrants and Turks in Germany are harbingers of the long hot summers that are coming to Europe. But should Europe reject immigration, and European women refuse to have children, the continent will soon stare senescence in the face. America faces the same questions. If tens of millions of American girls and young women are determined not to have children, or to have no more than one, America either accepts mass immigration or the fate of Japan and Europe. But America has time to act. If Americans wish to preserve their civilization and culture, American women must have more children. While there is no guarantee that government incentives can change the mindset of women, a pro-family, pro-child bias can be built back into national policy. For what is more important than the permanence of the American nation and people? The Civil Rights Act should be amended to allow employers to pay higher wages to parents than to single people, to enable one spouse to stay home with infants and toddlers and to be there when the kids come home from school. This should apply to single dads and single moms. Instead of a tax deduction for daycare, so mothers can return to work, the federal tax credit for each child should be raised to $3,000. This might eliminate federal income taxes for large families as well as poor families. Give women freedom to choose whether to stay home with their kids and have more kids. America does not need more workers. America needs more children. Employers should be given tax incentives to pay higher wages to parents. We need to revive the idea of the family wage, where a single income is adequate for a secure and comfortable life for a growing family. The burden of corporate taxation should be shifted off family businesses and farms onto the larger corporations. As Ronald Reagan used to say, corporations don't pay taxes, people do. Corporations only collect taxes. Let the Fortune 500 do the collecting. Death taxes should be abolished immediately for family businesses, family farms, and family estates worth under $5 million. If new revenue is needed to pay for these family tax cuts, it can be obtained through taxes on consumption and duties on imports. If America has a crisis, it is certainly not a lack of imported consumer goods down at the mall. Today, the values of feminism and the counterculture are built into our social policies and tax code. Conservatives should act to remove them. A free society cannot force women to have children, but a healthy society can reward those who preserve it by doing so. For 2 decades, Republicans have touted the supply-side benefits of cuts in marginal tax rates. They have been proven right. and tax cuts are a positive good. But what is at stake now is far more important than whether our economy grows at 3 or 4%. It is the survival of our civilization, culture, and country. Yet, easing the economic burden of raising children is no substitute for a revival of religious faith. For strong faith and big families go hand in hand. Among white Americans today, it is no surprise where the highest birth rate may be found, in Utah. Assimilation. In Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention, Governor Morris is quoted as saying, "Every society from a great nation down to a club has the right of declaring the conditions on which new members should be admitted." To stem today's invasion of the United States and assimilate our 28.4 million foreign-born, America must, without apology, exercise that right. Legal immigration should be rolled back to 250,000 each year. Welfare benefits should be restricted to Americans. Immigration laws should be rewritten to end chain immigration, where new immigrants are entitled to bring in their extended families. In short, immigration laws should be rewritten with the emphasis on what is best for America. The H-1B program, extended to benefit Silicon Valley, under which 200,000 professional workers are brought in yearly, should be suspended. In 2000 and 2001, U.S. high-tech workers lost tens of thousands of jobs. College grads cannot find the jobs they thought would be there. To bring in foreign workers to compete with our own jobless citizens is to betray our own workers and their families. We should put Americans first. A new amnesty for illegal aliens, as proposed by President Fox, would invite tens of millions more to break America's immigration laws and break into our country, in anticipation of yet another amnesty. It would be tantamount to declaring open borders. Opposition to amnesty is an imperative. The United States must summon up the moral courage to deport illegal aliens. If there is no sanction for breaking into the United States, what is the sense of having immigration laws? If we turn a blind eye to what is happening on our borders, a huge slice of the third world will arrive here in the first decades of the 21st century. For the word is out that the candy store is open and the cop no longer walks the beat. The horrific atrocities at the World Trade Center and Pentagon, the other acts of terrorism that have occurred, should be wake-up calls to this generation of what is at risk in our naive embrace of open borders. The world is not as we wish it would be, but a world where some regimes and rulers and renegade terrorists bear a murderous hatred of America. And because of our immigration policies, our enemies are already inside the gates. To preserve the security and freedom of our people, we must run them down and remove them from our midst, and protect our borders far better than we have in recent decades. The survival of a free society depends upon it. Immigrant children should be immersed in English from the day they enter an American classroom. Most immigrant parents want it for their children. More important, the nation needs it. And immersion works. As the New York Times reports, 2 years after Californians voted to end bilingual education and force 1 million Spanish-speaking students to immerse themselves in English as if it were a cold bath, those students are improving in reading and other subjects at often striking rates according to standardized test scores. Ken Noonan, the founder of the California Association of Bilingual Educators, was among the most vociferous opponents of Proposition 227, whose purpose was to end bilingual education. But 2 years after his defeat, Noonan was singing the praises of Proposition 227. "I thought it would hurt kids. The exact reverse occurred, totally unexpected by me. The kids began to learn, not pick up, but learn, formal English, oral and written, far more quickly than I thought they could." A Californian whose own Mexican mother never learned English, Noonan went on, "You read the research and they tell you it takes 7 years. Here are kids within 9 months in the first year, and they literally learn to read." If we are to remain one nation and one people, an end to bilingual education is essential. For two languages means two cultures, and eventually two countries. The American people know this. English must become the official language of the American people. The Republican Party's drive to make Puerto Rico a state should be defeated. Like Cuba and Costa Rica, Puerto Rico is a separate country with its own language, customs, and culture. Her people's right to independence and eventual nationhood should not be taken away. The U.S. Border Patrol should get the manpower it needs to police our borders, and Americans alone should decide whether and when our national family should be enlarged. If President Fox wants open borders, let him open up his own border with Guatemala. Businesses that repeatedly hire illegal aliens to avoid paying the wages and providing the benefits and protections legislated for American workers should be prosecuted. Any expansion of NAFTA should be opposed. As the European Economic Community, EEC, inexorably evolved from a customs union into a political union, a U.S.-Mexico economic union is a fatal step towards political union of the United States and Mexico, i.e., the end of true independence and nationhood. If Mr. Bush is not aware of this, President Fox is. The history and culture of Mexico and of our Southwest are inseparable, but we remain separate and distinct nations, neighbors, not brothers. And as that most American of poets, Robert Frost, wrote, "Good fences make good neighbors." Let us walk the line and set the wall between us once again. The sovereignty question. In its agenda for world community, the Humanist Manifesto of 1973 was almost prophetic. Americans, it declared, must transcend the limits of national sovereignty and move towards the building of a world community. We look to a world order based on transnational federal government. In words that echo Gramsci in The Greening of America, the manifesto rhapsodized, "The true revolution is occurring at the present juncture of history. Commitment to all humankind is the highest commitment of which we are capable. It transcends the narrow allegiances of church, state, party, class, or race in moving toward a wider vision. What more daring a goal for humankind than for each person to become, in ideal as well as practice, a citizen of the world community?" This idea of an end of nations and the creation of a world government has been a dream of intellectuals since Kant. Though utopian, it recurs in every generation. It is a Christian heresy. When the philosophers of the Enlightenment repudiated the Church, they needed a substitute for the Church's promise and vision of heaven. So they created a new vision of all mankind laboring together to create heaven here on earth. The trading away of the hereafter for the here and now is the bargain Esau bought into when he sold Jacob his birthright for a bowl of porridge. And the children of the Enlightenment are now far along with this project. As Christianity dies in the West, the foundation and first floor of a world government are already in place. The UN is to be its parliament. With the Security Council its upper chamber, the veto is to be abolished, and the General Assembly its lower house. The International Criminal Court, the World Court, and the World Trade Organization would constitute its judicial branches. The IMF is its Federal Reserve. The World Bank and its sister development banks are the foreign aid agencies. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization and the World Health Organization are among its welfare agencies. The Kyoto Protocol on global warming creates the global EPA. The model and forerunner is the European Union, the EU. Strobe Talbot, Clinton's roommate at Oxford and architect of his Russian policy, in a column a decade ago in Time, described the regime that will rule in the closing decades of the 21st century. All countries are basically social arrangements. No matter how permanent and even sacred they may seem at any one time, In fact, they are all artificial and temporary. Within the next 100 years, nationhood as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority. A phrase briefly fashionable in the mid-20th century, citizen of the world, will have assumed real meaning by the end of the 21st. In Talbot's vision, the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank are the proto-ministries of trade, finance, and development for a united world. Are we all clear that we want to build something that can aspire to be a world power, not just a trading bloc, but a political entity? Thundered Romano Prodi, president of the European Commission, to the European Parliament in February 2001. Do we realize that our nation states, taken individually, would find it far more difficult to assert their existence and their identity on the world stage? Europe is already face to face with the national question. Do its great nations, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Russia, and its ancient states, with their magnificent histories and heritage, Portugal, Spain, Austria, Hungary, Holland, Poland, Greece, all the rest, wish to live on as separate and unique peoples? Do they have the will to endure as who they are? Or are they weary of independence? Would they prefer national euthanasia inside a socialist superstate and a life as permanent dependencies of a Brussels bureaucracy? The great European Civil War lasted from 1914 to 1989. Fascism and Bolshevism were crushed. But that is not the end of history. With the war against international communism over, a new struggle against international socialism has begun. This is the decisive conflict of the 21st century. It will determine whether the unique cultures of the West survive or become the subcultures of a multicultural continent. It will determine whether the nations of Europe will survive independent and free or be converted into provinces of a European superstate where the exercise of their inherent right to preserve their unique identity will be forever outlawed. Today, the peoples of Europe are being told that decency, justice, and rightful restitution for their past sins require that they throw open their doors and share their national homes with the descendants of those their fathers misruled and persecuted, however many wish to come. Can the nations of Europe resist the non-negotiable demands of the cultural Marxists? For what is being demanded of them is nothing less than the demographic, national, and cultural suicide of their countries for the good of mankind. Commitment to all humankind is the highest commitment of which we are capable. It transcends the narrow allegiances of church, state, party, class, or race in moving toward a wider vision. So declared the Humanist Manifesto. But some of us yet believe our loyalty to our own families, countries, church, and culture comes first. So the lines are drawn in the battle of the century: patriotism or globalism, nation state or new world order, independence forever or global government. Independence is more precious than power, and countries are worth fighting for. And because men will not give love or loyalty to an EU, a UN, a WTO, or any international community, the fight for independence forever can be won if patriots of all nations pull together and do not lose heart. For what James Burnham said of liberalism is true of globalism. It does not offer ordinary men compelling motives for personal suffering, sacrifice, and death. It proposes a set of pale and bloodless abstractions, pale and bloodless for the very reason that they have no roots in the past, in deep feeling, and in suffering. Because it is a project of elites, and because its architects are unknown and unloved, globalism will crash on the Great Barrier Reef of patriotism. That is our belief, and in that is our hope. Nations may break up. Some may surrender their sovereignty to vanish inside a European superstate. But people will rebel, as they did against the Soviet Empire, and recreate the countries whence they came. Mr. Gore may have slipped his Kyoto Protocol by customs. Mr. Clinton may have signed us on to the UN International Criminal Court. But Mr. Bush has repudiated Kyoto, and he opposes the ICC. As for the WTO, it is paralyzed by transatlantic quarrels, and outside Davos, its admirers are few. And as the Battle of Seattle showed, the passion and fire, be it labor-right, nader-right, or far-right, were outside the hall in the street. Europe's peoples are growing wary of the brave new world being prepared for them by the Strobe tablets and Romano Prodis. At the EU summit in Nice, the smaller nations balked at new surrenders of national sovereignty. Danes rejected the euro. In March 2001, 77% of the Swiss and every single canton voted no in the Yes to Europe referendum that would have produced immediate negotiations to enter the EU. In some German-speaking cantons, the no vote reached 85%. When Ireland ignored a EU directive and cut taxes, Dublin was disciplined. "Sorry," said President Prodi, "but sometimes the teacher has to punish the best pupil." The Irish foreign minister, whose economy was growing at 8%, fired back. Perhaps when other countries in Europe have Ireland's sort of success, I will take more cognizance. Irish voters then torpedoed the Nice Agreement and EU expansion as a dilution of Dublin's voice in Europe and a threat to Irish sovereignty. Italians have elected a new center-right government that means to put Italy first. The German Christian Democrats are increasingly blunt about their desire to maintain their national identity and culture. British Tories went down to defeat, but the causes they espoused, preserving the nation and saving the pound, have majority support. Rising resistance in Europe needs to hear an echo from this side of the Atlantic. When the EU expands eastward, the crunch will come. An EU of 25 nations cannot be ruled from Brussels, unless Brussels acquires the power the US government wields over the 50 states. As the Cold War against world communism was won, the struggle against global socialism is not lost. Americans should resist any surrender of sovereignty, no matter which president or party favors it, and align themselves with the patriots of Europe, like Margaret Thatcher and the Eurosceptics, who are making retention of the British pound the red line of patriotism. For all countries, the choice is coming between national defiance and national extinction, and we cannot go gentle into that good night. How can Americans enlist in this battle? Oppose new funding to the IMF and World Bank. These agencies have squandered hundreds of billions of tax dollars on loans that would put most bankers in prison. But the IMF now has a golden hook in scores of countries to force them to conform to the dictates of the global elite. That hook needs to be removed. Press the President to send the treaty establishing the International Criminal Court that Mr. Clinton signed and the Kyoto Protocol that Mr. Bush has rejected to the Senate, with a recommendation that both be voted upon and voted down. Any UN attempt to seize governmental powers should be resisted, especially any taxes for exclusive UN use or any plans for a UN army. America's ultimate goal should be the abolition of the WTO and a return to bilateral trade treaties enforced by the United States and its trade partners, and an end to this international tribunal in which America has one vote and the European Union has 15. Oppose any expansion of NATO. Once a defensive alliance of free nations to block any invasion of Western Europe by Stalin's empire, NATO has been converted into a neo-imperialistic bloc, which now asserts a sovereign right to attack and invade small nations like Serbia in the name of democracy and human rights. The Founding Fathers would have been ashamed of what Clinton and Albright did to the Serbs. This small nation did not attack us, did not threaten us, did not seek war with us. Yet we smashed Serbia as horribly as Hitler had for defying our demand for an unrestricted right of passage through their land, to tear off the cradle of their country, Kosovo. Support a complete withdrawal of U.S. ground forces from Europe and Asia, and a review of all treaty guarantees that date back to a Cold War that ended a decade ago. Old allies such as South Korea should begin to provide the troops and pay the costs for their own defense. Every great empire of the last century perished for the same reason. Overextended, each involved itself in wars far beyond the scope of its own vital and national interests. Let us learn from history. While vigilance against terrorism and a defense against missile attack by rogue nations are national priorities, the best way to avoid any attack on our nation or its armed forces is to get them out of harm's way by disengaging the United States from ideological, religious, ethnic, historic, or territorial quarrels that are none of America's business. What happened on September 11, 2001, was a direct consequence of an interventionist U.S. policy in an Islamic world where no threat to our vital interests justifies our massive involvement. We are a republic, not an empire, and until we restore the foreign policy urged upon us by our founding fathers of staying out of other nations' quarrels, we shall know no end of war and no security or peace in our own homeland. Challenging Professor Samuel P. Huntington's thesis of a coming clash of civilizations, James Kurth wrote in The National Interest that Huntington's batteries, like the guns of Singapore, are pointed in the wrong direction. The real clash of civilizations will not be between the West and one or more of the rest. It will be between the West and the post-West within the West itself. This clash has already taken place within the brain of Western civilization, the American intellectual class. It is now spreading from that brain to the body politic. Exactly. Like colon cancer, the long-term threat to the West lies deep within, and whether the West survives is a question Western peoples will answer. As Pogo said, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." The revolution has thus far triumphed, but its tenure, like that of Danton and Robespierre, may be brief. For the civilization it is creating cannot endure. Like heroin, it gives a good high, but imbibed too deeply, it kills. 600 Americans had died of AIDS in 1983 when the author urged the White House to address the medical crisis. In a column that closed, "The poor homosexuals, they have declared war on nature, and nature is exacting an awful retribution." So it did. Hundreds of thousands have since died. Hundreds of thousands who carry the HIV virus are kept alive only by daily cocktails of miracle drugs. The sexual revolution has begun to devour its children. The statistics on abortion, divorce, collapsing birth rates, single-parent homes, teen suicides, school shootings, drug use, child abuse, spouse abuse, violent crime, incarceration rates, promiscuity, and falling test scores show how this society, in which the Cultural Revolution is ascendant, is decomposing and dying. Empty nurseries and full waiting rooms outside the psychiatrist's office testify that all is not well. But before this diseased culture runs its course, it may take the West down with it. Why cannot the new culture and civilization endure? First, the elite it has produced is unloved and commands no loyalty. Indeed, it is detested for its intolerance and amorality, and for what it has done to traditional heroes and the old faith. The public jubilation over Mr. Clinton's disgrace in the pardon scandal reflects the public's contempt for the counterculture he came to embody. Second, the ideology of the revolution clashes with the laws of human nature and nature's God. Thus, this new society is built on sand. Women are not the same as men, and saying so does not make it so. Women are profoundly different, with separate and distinct social roles that are not interchangeable, judicial orders notwithstanding. They cannot live as men do without calamitous consequences for the family, society, and country. Homosexuality is not redemptive, it is addictive. By the very way in which they define themselves, the homosexuals are killing themselves, physically, morally, and spiritually. So say Augustine, Aquinas, and the Atlanta Centers for Disease Control, as well as the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran. Who says otherwise? Even a glance at the obituary pages testifies that homosexuality is incompatible with a long life. Like other societies, ours is discovering that before he wrote his commandments in stone, God took the precaution of writing a copy on the human heart. Deny that his laws are binding, rage against them, you still cannot escape the consequences of living outside the laws of nature and of nature's God. We may indoctrinate children into believing that gender differences exist only in the mind, that all civilizations, cultures, religions, and nations are equal. The world will teach them they were lied to. While our current relativism asserts the equality of all cultures, writes Kenneth Minogue in New Criterion, nobody, of course, seriously believes this. Quite apart from technology, the moral inequality of cultures is conspicuous in the position of women in different cultures. It was only the West that abolished slavery. But it is a mark of current decorum, perhaps avoidance of the dreaded triumphalism, that we should not proclaim any superiority in European civilization, even though it is the one place the millions want to get into. In their hearts, who truly believes in the equality of all civilizations, cultures, faiths? Do followers of the Prophet believe Christianity is a religion equal to their own? Did the North American martyrs who died to bring the Catholic faith to the Iroquois believe Indian religions were entitled to equal respect? Did Cortes and Pizarro believe all civilizations were equal when they set out to conquer and convert the Aztecs and Incas? Have all cultures produced equally great works of poetry, prose, painting, sculpture, music, and architecture? Does anyone believe that? Or is that just polite prattle at the Metropolitan and the Museum of Modern Art? Are all nations equal? Why then are the refugees from all over the world fleeing to the West? Are all peoples equal? In America, we have equal rights under the law. But the idea of the innate dignity of every human being and of equal justice under law is not a product of China, Japan, Africa, or Arabia. It came out of the West. Is chattel slavery evil? Yes, but which faith first began to teach that? And what nation began the eradication of slavery? Was it not Christianity and the British nation? Under our First Amendment, all ideas and faiths have an equal right to be heard, but it is illogical and absurd to thereby conclude that all ideas and faiths are equal. All civilizations are not equal. The West has given the world the best that has been thought and taught. Western civilization and culture are superior. One person, one vote Democracy is not an inviolate principle. It is a utilitarian idea. On a global basis, it will not do. With 4% of the world's people and 30% of its economic wealth and military power, Americans should be the last people on earth to be babbling nonsense about the equality of nations, and the last people to yield an ounce of sovereignty to the Tower of Babel on Turtle Bay. A world government in which all nations and peoples have an equal voice in determining the destiny of man is absurd. The pilot flies the plane, not the passengers, and parents do not give toddlers a voice and vote in family decisions. This is not a call to arrogance, but to a new moral certitude and self-confidence on the part of those to whom the truth has been given. In his 1931 essay, A Plea for Intolerance, Bishop Fulton Sheen deplored that want of intellectual backbone that caused the modern preacher to straddle the ox of truth and the ass of ignorance. Towards some things, Sheen admonished us, moral people must be intolerant. Tolerance applies only to persons, but never to truth or principles. About these things we must be intolerant. Right is right if nobody is right, and wrong is wrong if everybody is wrong. And in this day and age we need, as Mr. Chesterton tells us, not a church that is right when the world is right, but a church that is right when the world is wrong. The revolution will be short-lived, because the spirit of cynicism it has bred in the young will turn against it. Its icons will be smashed by the barbarians it has spawned. Critical theory is a game all can play. The politics of personal destruction used on John Tower and Robert Bork are now a weapon in the arsenals of both sides in the culture war. With the revolution in power, the cynical attitude of the 60s slogan, "Don't trust anybody over 30, is easily turned against it. With Western culture, the immune system of our civilization, discredited and damaged, the new America is as defenseless as the old. When German panzers were at Moscow's gates, Stalin discovered that few would die for Bolshevism, but her people would fight to stop the rape of Mother Russia. Patriotism saved the motherland, but American patriotism has been subverted by the sappers of the culture war. When Madeleine Albright, William Cohn, and Sandy Berger went to Ohio State to drum up support for renewed bombing in Iraq, they found that the Gen Xers were no more enthusiastic about Clinton's wars than Bill Clinton and his Woodstock comrades had been to fight Nixon's war. "Can't we all just get along?" Rodney King plaintively asked as the riots raged in LA, after the cops who had thrashed him were acquitted in Simi Valley. If only we could. But the painful truth is, we cannot all just get along, because we are going through a civil war of the soul, a clash over who we are, what we believe, what we stand for as a people. It is an irrepressible conflict, for it is about first things. Those who deny that the culture war is at root a religious war have not dug down to its roots. It is self-delusion to believe that there can be a brokered peace. This revolution will quickly violate any armistice we agree upon, for it is about absolute power and the annihilation of the old America. Conservatives and traditionalists are called racists, fascists, bigots, extremists, homophobes, and Nazis, because to the revolution that is who and what we are. The assaults on our history and heroes are not going to end, because to the Cultural Revolution that is the way to purify America of a hateful legacy and make her a good nation. Look at what is being asked of the God and Country people. Their children are forced to drink from a culture they consider decadent, if not demonic. The government uses their tax dollars to fund what they believe is the slaughter of unborn children. They must send their young to schools they believe imperil their faith. They are told to give up trying to create a godly nation that conforms to biblical law, for that is now forbidden by the Constitution. This is the asking price of peace in the culture war, and for millions of Christians, the price is too high. A society steeped in pornography, where homosexual unions are blessed by clergy, and from which all Christian symbols and celebrations have been purged, is one they no longer wish to live in. To the silent majority, government is losing its legitimacy. They have not resisted violently, for they are not a violent people, but they are a put upon people, who have begun to see the government as them, not us, and they are searching for ways to secede from a decadent, dominant culture. In Gone with the Wind, a bitter Rhett Butler, patience exhausted, takes his final leave of Tara. A shaken Scarlet cries after him, "But what will I do?" Rhett replies, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." Less and less do we Americans seem to give a damn what happens to the other side in the culture war. We just want out of this marriage. We are drifting toward breakpoint. Has the time come to split the blanket and concede the truth of Dos Passos's verdict? All right, we are two nations. A few years ago, a neoconservative magazine editorialized that you cannot both love your country and loathe its government. But Washington did not hate England when he went to war to overthrow the rule of Parliament and King. Robert E. Lee did not hate the country he had fought for in Mexico. He only wished to be free of its government. Alice Roosevelt and Charles Lindbergh loathed FDR, but they loved America and did not want her dragged into another European bloodbath that they believed was not America's war. A man can love his country and loathe the government led by Mr. Clinton. Millions did. If America is ceasing to be the good country we grew up in, what do we owe the government? The answer lies in Matthew 22:21. Render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Traditionalists should emulate Roman converts. The empire still merited their allegiance, but they came to see the culture as decadent. Escape was essential. So they separated themselves from old comrades and customs and created a new Christian culture in their own families and within the fellowship of the converted. They remained loyal to the Roman Empire, but seceded from its pagan culture. Secession from this culture can take many forms, from giving up movies and TV, to blacking out channels, to homeschooling, to protesting outside abortion clinics, to moving to a less polluted environment. The Amish seceded long ago. Orthodox Jews have seceded. Mormons seceded with Brigham Young's trek to the Great Salt Lake. Catholics in the 19th century removed their children from public schools to put them in parish schools. In the 1980s, evangelical and fundamentalist Christians began to create an alternative culture and parallel institutions: Christian schools, TV shows, magazines, radio stations, networks, bookstores, and publishing houses. Millions of children attend Catholic and Christian schools. Over 1 million are homeschooled. Addressing Catholic traditionalists, Wanderer columnist James K. Fitzpatrick writes, "We will have to adjust to life as a subculture with all that implies. The alternative is making our peace with the new America, being shaped by the Hollywood porn merchants. That surrender is unthinkable." Adults can secede from the dominant culture by buying books, tapes, and CDs. The local video store may be pushing adult films, but Blockbuster carries the finest films ever made. What Hollywood produced yesterday is not what Hollywood produces today. The films of yesterday celebrated heroism, honor, and patriotism. Gladiator, The Patriot, and 13 Days, honored and popular films of 2000, were positive films. When, in 1999, the American Film Institute compiled its list of the 100 greatest American movies, only one movie made after 1982 was in the top 50. The much derided 1950s had 7 of the top 20. On the Waterfront, Singin' in the Rain, Sunset Boulevard, The Bridge on the River Kwai, Some Like It Hot, All About Eve, and The African Queen. 15 among the other 1950s films in the 100 greatest: High Noon, Rear Window, Streetcar Named Desire, From Here to Eternity, Rebel Without a Cause, Vertigo, An American in Paris, Shane, Ben-Hur, Giant, A Place in the Sun, and The Searchers. In 1998, the Modern Library Board offered its selection of the 100 best novels of the 20th century. While the counterculture was represented, the list contained 4 of Conrad's works, including Lord Jim and Heart of Darkness, Orwell's Animal Farm and 1984, Huxley's Brave New World, Kessler's Darkness at Noon, Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men, William Golding's Lord of the Flies, Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, and Kipling's Kim. The 100 nonfiction books had a leftward tilt, but T.S. Eliot, H.L. Mencken, Shelby Foote, Tom Wolfe, Winston Churchill, Paul Fussell, and British war historian John Keegan made the cut. It would not be difficult for traditionalists to put together a reading course for high school and college students, plus a film library, that would introduce America's young to the best that has been written, spoken, and put on the silver screen. If raw sewage is being dumped in the reservoir, buy bottled water. The rule applies to a polluted culture. The internet can put together communities of political and religious belief. Adults can find what they want in biography, history, politics, and news, not only in books but on cable TV. Radio carries trash talk, but also Christian and conservative talk, and classical and popular music, as well as acid rock, hard rock, satanic rock, hip-hop, and gangsta rap. For children, escape is far more difficult. Hedonism pervades the music they hear, the movies they see, MTV, and primetime. It is in the magazines and books they read. There is no way out. Perhaps the best parents can do is to inculcate in their children values by which to live, and pray these values see them through the great dismal swamp of American popular culture in the 21st century. Politics. But if we can secede from the dominant culture, we cannot escape from politics. To do so is to surrender and permit the Cultural Revolution to have its way with America. So where do we go from here? Clearly, the White House wants the cup of culture war to pass away. Mr. Bush said as much when his Florida victory was confirmed. I believe things happen for a reason, and I hope the long wait of the last 5 weeks will heighten a desire to move beyond the bitterness and the partisanship of the recent past. Our nation must rise above a house divided. Americans share hopes and goals and values, far more important than any political disagreements. "Isn't it pretty to think so?" said Jake in the sad final line of "The Sun Also Rises." But the truth is that America is a house divided, and Americans do not share hopes and goals and values. That is what the culture war is all about. As Chilton Williamson Jr. writes in Chronicles, the revolution is not willing to live and let live. The old America would deny the new America abortion, gay marriage, and certain other demands at war with natural law and traditional morality. The new America would deny the old anything it finds incompatible with the progressive agenda de jour: tobacco, alcohol, fast foods, red meat, keeping caged birds, hunting, rodeos, sport shooting, prayer at football games, hate speech, free speech, freedom of association, four-wheel drive trucks, guns. Cheyenne, Wyoming can tolerate the existence of New York City and Los Angeles, writes Williamson. But LA and New York City can't abide knowing that out there on the steppes and in the mountains of the great American desert, the other America is leading an existence that fits its own particular circumstances, customs, and preferences. The culture war is not going away because it is not finished with us yet. Eventually, even Mr. Bush, a reluctant warrior, will be dragged in. There are many things that you can refuse to do with a man. You can refuse to work for him, dine with him, or talk to him. But if he wants to fight, you have got to oblige him. Leaders are paroled from combat in the culture war only by exiting the field or raising a white flag. Since the 60s, no president has been able to escape. Eventually, all had to take sides, and all paid a price. But until Mr. Bush takes up his post, traditionalists need to take stock of the ground lost. As Dorothy said, "Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore." This is not Ronald Reagan's America. A large slice of America has been Clintonized. There may be more of them than I thought, said Rush Limbaugh post-election. Were an election held today between Clinton and Reagan, 90% of our cultural elite would forget the pardons and vote for Clinton. Could Reagan carry California today as he did 4 times? Could a presidential candidate who is pro-life sweep 49 states as Nixon did in 1972 and Reagan did in 1984? Politics cannot pull the West out of its crisis, for it is not a crisis of material things, but a crisis of the soul. The refusal of Western women to have children. The embrace by Western society of hedonism and materialism. These will not be undone by Tom DeLay, Trent Lott, or Mr. Bush. But politics is not irrelevant. FDR called the presidency preeminently a place of moral leadership. Steps can be taken to impede the revolution and advance the day when, as with the evil empire, rollback begins. The imperial judiciary. Reshaping the Supreme Court is crucial to any strategy for victory in the culture war, for the court is the battering ram of revolution. It must be returned to constitutionalism, and the people left alone to create the society they wish to live in and have their children grow up in. If America is still a free land, that is their right. I have no litmus test for justices, says President Bush, but conservatives do have a litmus test. No liberal judicial activists need apply. Nominees such as his father's choice, David Souter, or President Ford's choice, John Paul Stevens, would be an irredeemable blunder. Eventually, the incorporation doctrine, by which all the restrictions imposed on Congress by the Constitution are imposed, through the 14th Amendment, on the states, must be overturned. From Miranda to Roe v. Wade, this is the authority by which the court dictates to the nation. In November of 1996, Father Richard John Newhouse, editor of First Things, conducted a symposium, The End of Democracy, the Judicial Usurpation of Politics. Born out of anger and frustration with recent court rulings, the symposium was based on this proposition. The government of the United States of America no longer governs by the consent of the governed. The question here explored is whether we have reached, or are reaching, the point where conscientious citizens can no longer give moral assent to the existing regime. The authors, wrote Father Newhouse, examine possible responses to laws that cannot be obeyed by conscientious citizens. These responses range from noncompliance, to resistance, to civil disobedience, to morally justified revolution. Among the contributors was Robert Bork, who wrote, "When the VMI decision came down, my wife said the justices were behaving like a band of outlaws." An outlaw is a person who coerces others without warrant in law. That is precisely what a majority of the present court does. The former U.S. Appellate Court judge suggested it may be time that public officials began defying the Supreme Court. Perhaps an elected official will one day simply refuse to comply with the Supreme Court decision. That suggestion will be regarded as shocking, but it should not be. To the objection that a rejection of a court's authority would be civil disobedience, the answer is that a Supreme Court that issues orders without authority engages in an equally dangerous form of civil disobedience. Several neoconservatives were shocked by the premise that the U.S. government was a regime that had lost its legitimacy. They called the symposium an outburst of anti-Americanism. A few resigned from the board of First Things. But the symposium proved beneficial. It moved the issue to a discussion of action. Given that the court has assumed dictatorial powers over a democratic republic, what do we do about it, besides deplore it? One answer is to support public officials who are willing to ignore court orders and pay the price the court imposes. Alabama's Judge Roy Moore, for one, said that the United States would have to send troops to remove a plaque with the Ten Commandments from the wall of his courtroom. He would refuse to take it down, no matter who ordered him. Another recourse is to demand that members of Congress use their constitutional power to circumscribe the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and pass legislation that would enable Americans to recall and fire federal judges by majority vote, as they can in California. Term limits can be imposed on federal judges by legislation. If there is a will, there is no shortage of constitutional ways by which a people can recapture their right to rule themselves. Cashier the old generals. During Vietnam, Senator George Aiken was hailed for his witticism. "Let's declare victory and get out." Aiken was urging us to accept defeat, and all that meant for the Vietnamese and Cambodians who had put their lives and trust in us. It was Aiken's clever way of saying, "Let's cut and run and say we won." The humor escaped some of us. Yet the Aiken approach appears to have found favor today with some neoconservatives in the culture war. I regret to inform Pat Buchanan that the culture wars are over, and the left has won, said Irving Kristol after my address to the Houston Convention. Gertrude Himmelfarb, Mrs. Irving Kristol, wrote in One Nation, Two Cultures, "Let us be content with the knowledge that the two cultures are living together with some degree of tension and dissension, but without civil strife or anarchy. America has a long tradition of tolerance that serves as a mediating force between the two cultures, assuaging tempers and subduing passions, while respecting the very real, very important differences between them." Pace, Mrs. Kristol. Should passions be subdued when 1,000,000 babies are yearly butchered? When infanticide is legal? When Catholic symbols are desecrated? When children are taught the pleasures of perversion in public schools?
When our culture is poisoned and our heroes are dragged through the mud, should we be content with such a situation? Are these the kinds of differences we should respect? After the Nazis marched into Paris without a shot being fired, André Gide wrote, "To come to terms with yesterday's enemy is not cowardice, but wisdom, as well as accepting what is inevitable." Gide was wrong. But if the crystals take the Atkin line, the neo-conservative Norman Podhoretz has sailed for Yalta. In his celebration of himself, My Love Affair with America, Podhoretz sees the culture war dissolving into an as yet unspoken and unratified accommodation between the two sides, a de facto armistice on the ground. He quotes approvingly one Mark Lilla on the terms of armistice. Americans see no contradiction in holding down day jobs in the unfettered global marketplace, the Reaganite dream, the left nightmare, and spending weekends immersed in a moral and cultural universe shaped by the 60s. But the moral and cultural universe shaped by the 60s was a sewer. Podhoretz cites as a role model Hugh Weldon, who ran the BBC television series and let writers and producers get away with using obscene language and filming sexual encounters that approached the level of soft porn. How did Weldon deal with these debasers of the culture? He cautioned them that their shows might fail to attract or hold a sizable audience. No wonder we are losing. This is capitulation in a battle for what T.S. Eliot defined as that which makes life worth living. Podhoretz echoes Henry Kissinger's famous line in the final weeks of the Paris negotiations on Vietnam: "Peace is at hand," a phrase even Henry must surely regret. As the 20th century approached its end, writes Podhoretz, I had the impression that some kind of peace was at hand. Tell it to the Boy Scouts. For such attitudes, neoconservatism has come to be known, in Sam Francis's phrase, as the harmless persuasion. The Crystals and the Podhoretzes are the summertime soldiers of the culture war. But America needs men and women of more kidney, spleen, and heart if the struggle for the soul of America is not to be irretrievably lost.
Open defiance of political correctness. The right response to the intolerant new orthodoxy is defiance, ridicule, and counter-attack. Political adversaries who use terms like Nazi, fascist, anti-Semite, nativist, homophobe, bigot, xenophobe, and extremist have started a fight and should be accommodated. Courage is contagious, and defiance can lead to a recovery of will. Americans love underdogs, rebels, and fighters, and are fed up with being demonized and dictated to. The old admonition, "Speak truth to power," will stand us in good stead. In 2001, provocative ads were placed in several college newspapers, headlined, "10 Reasons Why Reparations for Slavery is a Bad Idea, and Racist, Too." Placed by David Horowitz, the ads argued that blacks owe America more than America owes to blacks. At Harvard and Columbia, editors refused the ad. At Brown, students seized the first press run. With a few dollars, the emerging moral shakedown was exposed, and the country got a good look at where the true intolerance in America may be found. Countering hate crimes propaganda with truth. Rather than just oppose hate crimes laws designed to demonize white males, conservatives should insist that the Justice Department report annually on all interracial violent crimes, including gang assaults and gang rapes, by race and victim, and break down all sex crimes against children into the heterosexual and homosexual. If it is true that white males commit a disproportionate share of interracial crimes, we ought to know. If it is untrue, let us find out who does. Justice should also report on all violent assaults against immigrants, and all violent assaults by immigrants. News reports seem to emphasize the former and ignore the latter. Again, let's learn the truth, and, as L. Smith said, let's get it out in the open, because nothing un-American can live in the sunlight. Pro-life laws. Only 17 to 19% of Americans favor outlawing all abortions, but the number of those who claim to be pro-life has risen from 33 to 43% in 5 years, and 51% believe there should be at least some restrictions. This is enough support to have Congress vote both to outlaw partial birth abortion and to ban all abortions of babies who can live outside the womb. Such a bill could rally the churches that still consider life the paramount issue.
Catholic bishops could be pressed to demand the support of Catholic legislators, including Senators Dodd, Leahy, Harkin, Daschle, and Kennedy, who need to be reminded of the words of Pius XI in his 1930 encyclical Casti Connubii on Christian marriage.
Those who hold the reins of government should not forget that it is the duty of public authority to defend the lives of the innocent, among whom we must mention in the first place infants hidden in the mother's womb. And if the public magistrates do not defend them, but by their laws and ordinances betray them to death at the hands of doctors and others, let them remember that God is the judge and avenger of innocent blood which cries from earth to heaven. The late Pope's words could be read from the pulpit at Sunday Mass the week of the vote. Since the Supreme Court overturned a Missouri ban on partial birth abortions, Congress has been reluctant to enact a federal ban. But the time has come for Congress and the President to exercise their rights under the Constitution and to lead the court back into the narrow stall set aside for it in the Constitution. Citizen boycotts. The Montgomery bus boycott marked the birth of the modern civil rights movement. An NAACP boycott caused business leaders to plead for the Confederate battle flag to be removed from atop the Capitol in South Carolina. Boycotts can also be used to punish those who assault traditional values and serve as recruitment vehicles for a traditionalist coalition. The Baptist boycott of Disney failed only for a lack of focus. It was a declaration of economic war on a vast and disparate media empire that includes ESPN, ABC, Disney World, the History Channel, and the Anaheim Angels. But this legitimate democratic weapon of consumer boycott can be used to good effect if good folks will focus on a single product of a single advertiser. When Ronald Reagan began the rollback of the Soviet Empire, he did not send NATO's armies crashing into Central Europe. Rather, he overran tiny Grenada. A Grenada strategy can work. How? The same way Cesar Chavez won recognition for California farm workers, by leading a boycott of table grapes. If traditionalists and Republicans would unite, select a single product being advertised on one particularly offensive TV show with weak ratings, and everyone would boycott that one product, they could force the advertiser to pull his ads. Then follow up on the next product, until no one is willing to pay the cost of advertising on a TV show offensive to so many. If the weapon worked for Cesar Chavez and the NAACP, there is no reason it cannot work for traditionalists. Initiatives and referenda. Soon after South Carolina took down the battle flag, and Georgia abolished the state flag containing the St. Andrew's Cross, came Mississippi's turn. After fumbling the hot potato for months, Mississippi legislators tossed it to the people to decide in a referendum. Did they wish to keep the Magnolia state flag with its replica of the Confederate battle flag, or reject and replace it? The governor, editorial pages, and business community lined up for abolition of the old flag, and Republican senators Trent Lott and Thad Cochran maintained a discreet silence. On April 17, 2001, the people of Mississippi voted 65 to 35 to keep their 104-year-old flag. The call of tradition defeated the command of money. Even a few minority counties bravely voted for the old flag. The message? On matters of culture and morality, traditionalists should take decisions away from elected officials and return them to the people. The last best hope of preserving and reviving a Judeo-Christian culture rests with citizens immune to the power of money and unconcerned with media disapproval. The author of our Constitution believed in the people's right to rule themselves. As the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, wrote Madison, it seems strictly consonant to the Republican theory to recur to the same original authority whenever it may be necessary to enlarge, diminish, or new model the power of government. Not all decisions can be taken by popular vote. Not all decisions by the people are going to be warmly received by traditionalists. After all, the adversary culture has made deep inroads. But a referendum is at least a court of final appeal from dictatorial judges and craven legislators. Defending the Cultural Revolution. If Republicans could be convinced they had no choice but to fight a culture war imposed upon them, they could wreak havoc on their tormentors. For the federal government is today the exchequer of the Cultural Revolution. If a Republican Congress would identify and terminate all discretionary federal funds to organizations like Planned Parenthood and the NAACP, and close down agencies like the Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, the Department of Education, and the Civil Rights Commission, they could demobilize whole armies of their adversaries. Unfortunately, Republicans are fearful of being branded as divisive. Nevertheless, some courageous researchers should produce a listing of all institutions with an arm in the federal trough, and the White House and Congress should be asked to defund all of those, left or right, that play politics with tax dollars. As Jefferson wrote, to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. Congress should abolish President's Day and restore Washington's birthday to honor the father of our country. The California Civil Rights Initiative, which voters passed 60 to 40, outlawed racial discrimination or favoritism by the state government. A congressman should be found to put the language of the CCRI, written by Ward Connerly of the Board of Regents of the University of California, into legislation, and have Congress vote it up or down as the Civil Rights Act of 2002. The wording is clear. The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. Asked his view of this statement, Senator Joseph Lieberman, Mr. Gore's vice presidential nominee, responded, "I can't see how I can be opposed to it. It is basically a statement of American values, and says we shouldn't discriminate in favor of somebody based on the group they represent. Indeed, the words define a colorblind society. If Congress cannot accept this language, which is in the spirit of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we need a new Congress." Devolution. In Britain, devolution meant the transfer of power from the Parliament in London to Scotland, Wales, and Ulster, and devolution may be the salvation of traditionalism. Among the historic victories of secular humanism was the Supreme Court's expulsion of all vestiges of Christianity from the public schools. As the near monopoly over the education of America's children by public schools no longer serves America's majority, that monopoly should be broken up. School boards, principals, and teachers should be granted independence and freedom to decide what children are taught, what books are used, what holidays are observed, what the character of the school shall be. Parents should be allowed to direct the tax dollars for their children's education to schools, public or private, secular or religious, of their own choosing. Tax credits are preferable to vouchers that can serve as the camel's nose of intrusive government in religious schools. Let the public schools reflect the diversity of our people, which would mean all boys' schools, all girls' schools, and co-ed schools that mirror the religious and cultural values of the parents whose children attend them. If one school wishes to celebrate Hanukkah, another Christmas, another Kwanzaa, let freedom ring and conformity disappear. Let the local community decide by democratic vote. We are a disparate people who disagree on almost everything. Let those differences be reflected in our schools. Cracking the education monopoly is far more vital to the health of our society than breaking up any monopoly Bill Gates ever had on computer software. Regrettably, both parties are moving toward nationalization. When Mr. Clinton is calling for school uniforms and Mr. Bush talks about how to raise the test scores of third graders, we are going the wrong way. Censorship. In Slouching Toward Gomorrah, Robert Bork raises an issue whose time has come, given the squalid, degraded art being pushed in the face of the American people. Must we tolerate this filth in the name of the First Amendment? Writes Bork, we seem too timid to state that Mapplethorpe's and Serrano's pictures should not be shown in public, whoever pays for them. We are going to have to overcome that timidity if our culture is not to decline further still. The photographs would be just as offensive if their display were financed by a scatterbrained billionaire. Where state censorship is not permitted, the moral censorship of a community is imperative. The nation needs a Supreme Court that understands that the Constitution permits states and communities to establish and enforce standards of decency. It is absurd, writes Jacques Barzun, that nations deplore violence and sexual promiscuity among the young, but pornography and violence in films and books, shops and clubs, on television and the internet, and in the lyrics of pop music cannot be suppressed, in the interests of the free market of ideas. When people accept futility and the absurd as normal, the culture is decadent, the historian adds. Detoxification of America's culture is far more important than any absolutist interpretation of the First Amendment. Teaching history. America's young have an astonishing ignorance of American history. Tests confirm it. This is both a tragedy and a danger. If the Supreme Court will not permit the immersion of children in their religious faith in public schools, it cannot forbid the immersion of children in their country's past. Parents and teachers should ensure that American history is taught every school year, and every book from which it is taught should be read by parents to ensure it includes the best of what Americans have said and done through the centuries. No nation has a history to rival ours. Peoples all over the world know this. So should Americans. Almost any child who is steeped in American history will emerge a patriot. A White House conference on American history should be called by President Bush to honor and hear our finest historians. Purpose: to call national attention to the scandalous history deficit among America's young, and to encourage the reading and teaching of American history in every school year and throughout a lifetime. The History Project should have the urgency of President Eisenhower's call for a new emphasis on science and physical fitness after the Soviets woke up our generation with Sputnik. A National History Bee on the lines of our National Spelling Bee could draw scores of thousands of children into a deeper study of their nation's past. The more a child learns of American history, the better he or she will be able to give the lie to those who make war on America's past. As important, the door to the past can be opened to these children for a lifetime. It is a magnificent and marvelous world to visit and explore. After the British defeat at Saratoga, a friend wrote to Adam Smith that the loss of the American colonies must devastate Britain. Smith wrote back, "There is a great deal of ruin in a nation." What Smith meant was that great nations endure defeats, even amputations, and go on. Many of our finest hours, from Trafalgar and Waterloo to Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, lay ahead of Britain and her empire in 1777. But what are the prospects for a renaissance of the West? Candor compels one to admit the prognosis is not good. Western man may be living out the final act of a tragedy that began 5 centuries ago. Then Christendom, though split by a schism between the Orthodox and Roman churches, and shattered by the Reformation, burst out of Europe to conquer the world. But with the 18th century came a far more radical challenge from within, not only to the authority of Rome, but to Christianity itself, and the cultural and political order to which it had given birth. Écrasez l'infâme, Voltaire signed off his letters. Wipe out the infamous thing, the Church. Mankind will not be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest, declared Diderot. Mankind was born free, but everywhere he is in chains, said Rousseau. France rose up and followed the scribblers. The monarchy came crashing down. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and the aristocrats went to the guillotine. The church was dispossessed and looted. Reason triumphed over faith and produced the September massacres, the Terror, Robespierre and the dictatorship, Bonaparte and the Empire, and a quarter-century of European wars from which France never recovered her unity or primacy. Then came Darwin to explain that we are all products of evolution, not creation, Marx to declare religion the opium of the people, and Nietzsche with the courage to take the thread of the argument to its logical end. God is dead, and we have killed him. And if God is dead, said Alosha in the Brothers Karamazov, all things are permissible. And if God is dead, logic leads us to another conclusion. Christianity is a fraud, to empower a class of clerical parasites, and merits swift eradication for its centuries of deceit and crimes against human dignity and progress. Then, once Christianity is abolished, we can follow science and reason and create the best of all possible worlds here on earth, the only world we shall ever know. But if Christianity gave birth to the West and undergirds its moral and political order, can the West survive the death of Christianity? Will Durant could find no significant example in history before our time of a society successfully maintaining moral life without the aid of religion. In Belloc's epigram, "The faith is Europe, Europe is the faith." But if that faith is dying, what is the belief system? What is the unifying principle? What is the source of moral authority that holds the West together? What makes the West unique? What are the ties that bind? Some say racial solidarity. But the past 500 years have been an endless chronicle of European peoples slaughtering one another, with World Wars I and II as climax to the horrors. And during that past half-millennium, the great enemies of Western faith, culture, and civilization have come out of the West. Moreover, America is a multi-ethnic, multi-racial nation today, and the nations of Europe will be tomorrow. Lincoln spoke of a people held together by the mystic cords of memory. But ask English, French, or Poles if they share mystic cords of memory with Germans and Russians. When Americans recall their history, some find it glorious. Others find it villainous and shameful. And as America and Europe open their doors to millions, from countries and continents Americans and Europeans once subjugated and colonized, the mystic cords of memory are as likely to divide us as to unite us. Democracy appears to be the great unifying idea agreed upon. Democracy, free markets, American values. This is what we stand for and will fight for. But this will not do. Most Americans could not care less how other nations govern themselves. A common belief in democracy is too weak a reed to support the solidarity of the West. It is an intellectual concept that does not engage the heart. Men will fight for family, friends, faith, freedom, and country. But democracy? When George Bush said that while floating off a Japanese island after being shot down and losing his co-pilot, his thoughts turned to the separation of church and state, people howled. If tomorrow the government of India, France, Italy, or Brazil fell to a military coup, how many Americans would think it was a matter worth rectifying at the cost of thousands of American lives? Democracy is not enough. Yeats was right. Once faith goes, things fall apart, the center will not hold. So it may be that the time of the West has come, as it does for every civilization, that the death of the West is ordained, and that there is no sense prescribing new drugs or recommending painful new treatments, for the patient is dying and nothing can be done. Absent a revival of faith or a great awakening, Western men and women may simply live out their lives until they are so few they do not matter. Growing up, one knew the Cold War could be won, while few realized how weak the other side was, how the ruthlessness of its rulers masked the hollowness of its system, and even fewer anticipated the sudden and total crash that came in 1989, still, we believed we could win, if we had the will, the perseverance, and the leadership to endure. But the cultural revolutionaries are succeeding where the Leninists failed. Communism ceased making converts in the West 2 generations before it fell. The Cultural Revolution is making converts even now, and democracy alone cannot defeat it. For democracy is defenseless against an ideology that has as its end the transformation of democracy by a new elite, a new faith, and a new order. Indeed, democracy facilitates the revolution, as its exploiters and enemies like Marcuse realized. Hitler showed what pathetic resistance democracy offers to true believers who can convert the masses to be rid of it. This is what Eliot meant when he wrote in 1939, "The term democracy, as I have said again and again, does not contain enough positive content to stand alone against the forces you dislike. It can easily be transformed by them. If you will not have God, and He is a jealous God, you should pay your respects to Hitler and Stalin." Once an ideology takes hold of a society, only a superior force or a superior ideology can exercise it. To defeat a faith, you must have a faith. What, other than Christianity, is the West's alternative faith? Again, Eliot. As political philosophy derives its sanction from ethics, and ethics from the truth of religion, it is only by returning to the eternal source of truth that we can hope for any social organization which will not, to its ultimate destruction, ignore some essential aspects of reality. But if Christianity has lost its appeal, and Christianity is not an option, the revolution will accelerate until we hit the retaining wall of reality. Perhaps Cyril Connolly was right when he wrote, half a century ago, "It is closing time in the gardens of the West." America is a paradox. She remains the greatest nation on earth, the land of opportunity, possessed of a vitality and energy unlike those of any other nation. We are the most blessed people on earth. Our science, technology, and medicine are the envy of mankind. Some of us are alive today only because of surgical procedures, medical devices, and miracle drugs that did not exist when we were young. We have so much to be thankful for, and we all owe America. And while no one can deny the coarseness of her manners, the decadence of her culture, or the sickness in her soul, America is still a country worth fighting for, and the last best hope of earth. Seated on his coffin in the wagon carrying him through the Virginia countryside to his place of execution, the old abolitionist John Brown was heard to say softly, "This is a beautiful country." And so it is. And that is why we must never stop trying to take her back. Acknowledgments. Has been my custom after campaigns in November of 2000, I retired to my basement office to read, reflect, and write. This book is a byproduct of that sabbatical. Without the support of my wife, Shelley, in the periods of transition and new beginnings that follow those campaigns, it could not have been done. I also want to express my gratitude yet again to my friend, editor, and agent, Freddie Friedman, for her loyalty and unindulgent editing. This is the fourth book of mine that Freddie has chaperoned through to publication. My thanks also to Tom Dunn, my editor and publisher at St. Martin's Press, for his confidence and assistance, and Sean Desmond, who saw the text through from word processor to the printed page. 5 friends were kind enough to read the text and to urge cuts, alterations, and additions, many of which were made. Sam Francis, Bill Lind, Scott McConnell, Bill Hawkins, and Alan Riskin. Also, I must thank Kara Hopkins, my intrepid researcher, who dug up quotes I could only recall from memory, and mined new facts, arguments, and ideas out of books I had not before read. Without her assistance, this work would not be as complete or as persuasive as I hope it is. Finally, my thanks to Joseph Chamey at the UN Population Division for his friendly and swift response to all my requests.